In the soft twilight of ancient memory, where the boundaries between history and legend blur like mist over still waters, there existed a civilization that has captivated human imagination for over 2 millennia. Far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where the Mediterranean Sea opens its arms to embrace the vast Atlantic Ocean, lay an island of extraordinary magnificence. This was Atlantis, a realm that emerged from the depths of philosophical discourse to become perhaps the most enduring mystery of the ancient world. The story begins not with the clash of bronze weapons or the rumble of marble being carved, but in the quiet contemplation of a brilliant mind in 4th century Athens. Plato, the philosopher whose thoughts would shape Western civilization, sat in his academy surrounded by olive trees and the gentle murmur of students engaged in discourse. It was here, in dialogues that would echo through centuries, that the tale of Atlantis first took form, emerging from the intersection of political philosophy and mythic imagination. The year was approximately 360 BCE when Plato penned his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, works that would introduce the world to a civilization both magnificent and tragic. In these texts, he spoke through the voice of Critias, who claimed to relay a story passed down through generations, originating from the great Athenian lawgiver Solon. According to this chain of transmission, Solon had learned of Atlantis during his travels in Egypt, from priests who preserved ancient records in the temple archives of Sais. These Egyptian priests, guardians of knowledge spanning millennia, spoke of events that had occurred 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing the existence of Atlantis in the mists of prehistory, around 9,600 BCE. It was a time when the world was young, when gods still walked among mortals, and when the very foundations of civilization were being laid by divine hands. The story they told was one of both wonder and warning. Atlantis, they claimed, had been a naval power of unprecedented might, controlling territories that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the very edges of Europe and Africa. Its people possessed knowledge and technology that surpassed even the greatest achievements of classical antiquity. Yet for all their power and wisdom, the Atlanteans fell victim to the same hubris that has plagued humanity throughout history, leading to their ultimate destruction in a single day and night of catastrophic ruin. But to understand Atlantis, one must first understand the world into which Plato introduced this tale. 4th century Athens was a city-state grappling with its own relationship to power and virtue. The golden age of Pericles had faded, the devastating Peloponnesian War had ended in defeat, and Plato himself had witnessed the execution of his beloved teacher, Socrates. In this context of political upheaval and moral questioning, the story of Atlantis served as both an idealized vision of what a society could achieve and a cautionary tale about the corruption that accompanies unchecked power. The mythic framework that Plato constructed for Atlantis was rooted in the cosmology of his time. According to his account, when the gods divided the world among themselves, Poseidon, lord of the seas and earthquakes, received the island of Atlantis as his domain. There, he found a mortal woman named Cleito, beautiful beyond description, dwelling alone on a hill in the center of the island. Poseidon fell in love with her, and to protect her from any who might wish her harm, he reshaped the very landscape around her dwelling. With divine power, Poseidon carved the hill into a series of alternating rings of land and water, creating a natural fortress that could only be accessed by ship. The innermost ring, where Cleito made her home, became the sacred heart of what would grow into the greatest civilization the world had ever known. There, in that protected sanctuary, Poseidon and Cleito became the progenitors of the Atlantean royal line, their union blessed by the god of the sea himself. Their firstborn son was Atlas, from whom the island and the surrounding ocean would take their names. Atlas was destined to be the first king of Atlantis, ruling over not just the central island, but also the most significant portion of the divided realm. His 9 brothers were granted dominion over other parts of the island and the surrounding territories, establishing a confederation of kingdoms that would endure for generations. The physical description of Atlantis that emerges from Plato's account is one of breathtaking grandeur and sophisticated engineering. The island itself was larger than Libya and Asia combined, a vast landmass situated in what we now know as the Atlantic Ocean. At its center lay the original hill of Plato, now transformed by Poseidon's divine architecture into a series of concentric rings that alternated between land and water. The innermost ring, approximately 3 stadia in diameter, contained the original hill where the royal palace and the most sacred temples were constructed. This central island was surrounded by a ring of water, which was in turn surrounded by a ring of land, then another ring of water, and so on, creating a pattern that resembled a vast target when viewed from above. Each ring was precisely engineered, with the water rings serving as harbours and canals, while the land rings provided space for the growing population and their increasingly elaborate constructions. The engineering marvels that connected these rings were as impressive as their design. Bridges of extraordinary craftsmanship spanned the water rings, allowing for the movement of people and goods throughout the city. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the great canal that cut through all the rings from the sea to the center, creating a waterway that allowed ships to sail directly from the ocean to the heart of the city. This canal was 50 stadia in length, 3 plethora in width, and 100 feet in depth, dimensions that would have made it one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. The outer ring of land, the largest of all, served as the foundation for the main city of Atlantis. Here, the Atlanteans constructed harbours that could accommodate vast fleets of ships, with dockyards and naval facilities that supported their maritime empire. The harbours were constantly filled with vessels arriving from every corner of the known world, bringing exotic goods, precious materials, and tribute from subject territories. The walls that surrounded each ring were themselves marvels of construction and artistry. The outermost wall was covered with brass, giving it a gleaming appearance that could be seen from great distances across the sea. The middle wall was coated with tin, creating a silvery shimmer that reflected the changing light of day. But it was the innermost wall that truly demonstrated the wealth and artistic achievement of the Atlanteans, for it was covered with orichalcum, a metal that Plato described as being second only to gold in value and beauty. Orichalcum, with its fiery red gleam, was said to be mined from the earth of Atlantis itself, a metal so precious that it was used only for the most sacred and important constructions. The very walls of the royal palace were said to be covered with this miraculous substance, causing the entire central island to glow with an otherworldly radiance, especially at sunset, when the dying light would set the orichalcum ablaze with reflected fire. Within the royal precinct on the central island stood the most magnificent temples and palaces that human hands had ever constructed. The Temple of Poseidon dominated the sacred space, a structure of such grandeur that it served as both a place of worship and a symbol of Atlantean power. The temple's exterior was covered entirely with silver, while its pinnacles were adorned with gold. Inside, the ceiling was composed of ivory decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum in intricate patterns that told the story of the island's divine origins. At the heart of the temple stood a colossal statue of Poseidon himself, crafted from gold and standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. The god was depicted as reaching toward the ceiling of the temple. Such was his immense size, while around the base of the statue stood 100 nereids riding dolphins, honoring the sea god and his divine retinue. The sight of this golden colossus, illuminated by the eternal flames that burned upon the altar, must have filled visitors with awe and reverence for the divine power that protected Atlantis. The royal palace, adjacent to the temple, was equally magnificent in its construction and decoration. Built on a scale appropriate for the descendants of a god, it contained chambers and halls that could accommodate the elaborate ceremonies and diplomatic functions of a great empire. The walls were decorated with the finest materials brought from across the known world, while the floors were laid with precious stones arranged in patterns that reflected the cosmic order beloved by Atlantean philosophy. But Atlantis was far more than a single magnificent city. The island itself was a realm of extraordinary natural beauty and abundance, shaped by both divine intervention and careful human cultivation. The climate was perpetually mild and pleasant, warmed by the surrounding ocean and blessed with gentle rains that nourished the fertile soil. The landscape was varied and dramatic, with mountains rising toward the sky in the north, while the southern regions rolled away in fertile plains crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. The mountains of Atlantis were renowned for their beauty and their wealth. Here, the Atlanteans quarried the stones used in their great constructions, including the mysterious orichalcum that added such splendor to their buildings. The mountain forests provided timber for their vast fleets, while mountain streams carried fresh water to the lower elevations through an elaborate system of aqueducts and channels. The plains of Atlantis represented perhaps the greatest achievement of human engineering and agricultural science in the ancient world. The entire southern region of the island had been transformed into a vast rectangular grid of canals and cultivated fields, creating a system of irrigation and transportation that supported millions of inhabitants. The Great Outer Canal that surrounded this entire region was 100 feet deep, a stad in width, and extended for a total length of 10,000 stadia around the perimeter of the plain. From this outer canal, a network of smaller channels carried water to every part of the agricultural region. These channels were spaced at intervals of 100 stadia, creating a perfect grid that allowed for precise control of water distribution and efficient transportation of agricultural products to the city. During the rainy season, excess water could be channeled safely to the sea, while during drier periods, water could be conserved and distributed where it was most needed. The agricultural abundance of Atlantis was legendary throughout the ancient world. The fertile soil, combined with the sophisticated irrigation system and favorable climate, produced crops in quantities that could support not only the island's own population, but also extensive trade with other regions. Grain fields stretched to the horizon, while orchards and gardens produced fruits and vegetables of exceptional quality and variety. The forests of Atlantis were equally remarkable, containing every species of tree known to the ancient world, and many that existed nowhere else. These forests supplied the timber for the great fleets that carried Atlantean power across the seas, while also providing materials for construction and a habitat for animals, both domestic and wild. The island was said to support herds of elephants, a detail that has intrigued scholars and added to the mystery of Atlantis's location, as well as countless other species that contributed to the wealth and diversity of the realm. The mineral wealth of Atlantis was perhaps its greatest natural advantage in building a maritime empire. In addition to the precious orichalcum, the island's mountains yielded gold, silver, copper, and iron in abundance. Precious stones could be found in mountain streams, while salt was harvested from coastal evaporation ponds. This mineral wealth provided the foundation for the extensive trade networks that connected Atlantis to the far corners of the ancient world. The people of Atlantis themselves were as remarkable as their island home. Descended from the union of the god Poseidon and the mortal Plato, they possessed both human intelligence and creativity, combined with divine favor and longevity. The royal bloodline, traced directly back to Atlas and his brothers, maintained the sacred connection to their divine ancestor, while the general population shared in the blessings that flowed from this divine heritage. Atlantean society was organized according to principles that reflected both their practical needs as a maritime empire and their philosophical understanding of cosmic order. At the apex stood the kings, descendants of the 10 sons of Poseidon, who ruled their respective territories according to ancient laws inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the Temple of Poseidon. These laws, given by Poseidon himself, governed not only the relationships between the kingdoms, but also the fundamental principles of justice and governance that shaped Atlantean civilization. The most important of these laws concerned the relationships between the kings themselves. They were bound by sacred oaths never to take up arms against one another, and any disputes between kingdoms were to be resolved through counsel and arbitration rather than warfare. This principle allowed the Atlantean Confederation to maintain internal peace, while directing their military might toward external expansion and the protection of their trade routes. Every 5th and 6th year alternately, the kings would gather at the Temple of Poseidon for a great council and ceremony. These gatherings were occasions of immense solemnity and significance, combining religious ritual with political deliberation. The ceremony began with the ritual hunt of a bull within the sacred precinct, using only wooden clubs and nooses in accordance with ancient tradition. The capture and sacrifice of the bull was performed without the use of iron, honoring the primitive simplicity of the original laws. The blood of the sacrificed bull was mixed with wine and poured over the sacred pillar containing the laws of Poseidon. Each king would then drink from the mixture and swear a solemn oath to uphold the laws and maintain justice in his realm. The ceremony concluded with the writing of judgments on golden tablets, which were dedicated to the god as permanent records of their deliberations. These gatherings were not merely ritual occasions, but served as the supreme governing body of the Atlantean Empire. Here, the kings would coordinate their policies, plan military campaigns, resolve disputes, and make decisions that affected the entire confederation. The combination of religious solemnity and practical governance created a system that maintained unity across the vast territories controlled by Atlantis, while respecting the autonomy of individual kingdoms. The military organization of Atlantis reflected both their maritime nature and their vast territorial holdings. Each kingdom was required to maintain specific numbers of troops according to ancient quotas established in the original laws. The island kingdom of Atlas, being the largest and most central, was responsible for providing the greatest number of warriors, while the other kingdoms contributed according to their size and resources. The military forces of Atlantis were divided into several categories, each adapted to different types of warfare and terrain. The most prestigious and important were the naval forces, which formed the backbone of Atlantean power. The Royal Navy consisted of 1,200 warships, each crewed by experienced sailors who had learned their craft on the extensive trade routes that connected Atlantis to the world beyond. These warships were marvels of ancient shipbuilding, constructed from the finest timbers of the Atlantean forests and equipped with bronze rams and other weapons of war. The largest vessels could carry entire companies of warriors, while smaller, faster ships served as scouts and messengers. The sight of an Atlantean fleet approaching over the horizon was said to inspire both awe and terror in those who witnessed it. The land forces of Atlantis were equally formidable, though organized differently from the naval contingents. Each district of the Great Plain was required to provide a certain number of warriors, creating an army that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. These forces included heavy infantry equipped with bronze armor and weapons, archers whose skills had been honed by hunting in the mountain forests, and cavalry mounted on the finest horses bred in the island's pastures. The chariots of Atlantis were particularly renowned for their craftsmanship and the skill of their drivers. These vehicles, constructed from the finest materials and drawn by carefully trained horses, served both as weapons of war and as symbols of royal power. The sight of Atlantean chariots charging across a battlefield, their bronze fittings gleaming in the sun and their wheels raising clouds of dust, was said to be one of the most terrifying and magnificent spectacles of ancient warfare. But the true strength of Atlantis lay not merely in the size of its armies or the quality of its equipment, but in the discipline and training of its warriors. The Atlantean military tradition emphasized not only individual courage and skill, but also the coordination and cooperation necessary for complex military operations. Warriors trained from youth in the arts of war, learning not only how to fight, but also how to work together as units in the coordinated campaigns that extended Atlantean power across the known world. The expansion of Atlantean power began gradually as traders and explorers ventured beyond their island home to establish contact with other civilizations. The natural advantages of their location, combined with their superior naval technology and navigation skills, allowed them to establish trading posts and colonies throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. These early ventures were primarily commercial in nature, seeking new markets for Atlantean products and sources of materials not available on the island itself. The first major expansion came with the establishment of colonies in what would later be known as North Africa and Southern Europe. These settlements, founded by younger sons of noble families and populated by volunteers seeking new opportunities, served as stepping stones for further expansion while providing valuable resources and strategic positions for the growing empire. The colonization process followed patterns that would become standard throughout Atlantean expansion. A site would be selected based on strategic considerations such as natural harbors, defensive positions, and access to local resources. The colonists would establish a fortified settlement, often incorporating local populations through treaties and intermarriage. Over time, these settlements would grow into significant cities, complete with temples, harbors, and administrative buildings constructed in the distinctive Atlantean style. The relationship between the mother city and these colonies was carefully structured to maintain unity while allowing for local adaptation. Each colony was ruled by a governor appointed by the appropriate king, but local customs and traditions were generally respected as long as they did not conflict with fundamental Atlantean principles. This flexibility allowed the empire to expand rapidly while maintaining the loyalty of diverse populations. Trade was the lifeblood of the expanding Atlantean empire, and the wealth generated by commerce provided the resources necessary for further expansion. Atlantean merchants were renowned throughout the ancient world for the quality of their goods and the fairness of their dealings. The distinctive products of their island home, particularly items made from orichalcum and other precious materials, were highly prized in foreign markets. The trade networks established by Atlantean merchants were marvels of ancient logistics and organization. Regular shipping routes connected the island home to colonies and trading posts throughout the known world, while careful records tracked the movement of goods and the collection of taxes and tribute. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across the empire facilitated trade and helped create a common economic space that benefited all participants. The wealth flowing into Atlantis from its expanding empire allowed for ever greater construction projects and artistic achievements. The cities of the island were constantly being improved and embellished, with new temples, palaces, and public buildings rising to accommodate the growing population and demonstrate the power and sophistication of Atlantean civilization. The architectural style that developed in Atlantis became influential throughout their empire and beyond, characterized by the use of massive stone blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision, elaborate bronze and gold decorations, and the incorporation of water features into building design. Atlantean architecture represented a unique fusion of engineering skill and artistic vision. The engineering capabilities of the Atlanteans were perhaps most clearly demonstrated in their massive construction projects. The Great Harbour Works, with their artificial islands and carefully engineered channels, required both sophisticated understanding of hydraulics and the ability to coordinate the labour of thousands of workers. The irrigation systems of the Great Plain represented an even more ambitious undertaking, transforming the natural landscape into a perfectly organised agricultural region. The cultural achievements of Atlantis were equally impressive, reflecting the prosperity and sophistication of their civilization. The arts flourished under royal patronage, with painters, sculptors, and craftsmen creating works that were prized throughout the ancient world. The distinctive Atlantean style, characterized by its incorporation of marine motifs and its use of precious materials, influenced artistic development in colonies and trading partners. Music and poetry held special places in Atlantean culture, with elaborate performances accompanying religious ceremonies and state occasions. The stories of their divine origins and heroic deeds were preserved in epic poems that were recited at festivals and gatherings, helping to maintain cultural unity across the far-flung empire. The development of writing systems allowed for the preservation of laws, historical records, and literary works, creating a cultural legacy that would endure even after the civilization itself had vanished. The religious life of Atlantis centered on the worship of Poseidon, their divine ancestor and protector. The great temple in the capital city served as the focal point for religious observances, but smaller temples and shrines throughout the empire maintained the connection between the Atlantean people and their patron deity. The priesthood, drawn from noble families and trained in both religious and secular knowledge, played important roles in government and education as well as in conducting religious ceremonies. The philosophy and science of Atlantis reflected their understanding of cosmic order and their practical needs as rulers of a vast empire. Atlantean scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, developing theories and techniques that influenced their engineering projects and navigation systems. The library of the royal palace was said to contain works on every branch of knowledge, written by the greatest minds of their civilization, and preserved on materials that would last for centuries. The educational system of Atlantis was designed to prepare young nobles for their future roles as administrators, military leaders, and cultural guardians. The curriculum included not only practical subjects such as mathematics, engineering, and military science, but also philosophy, literature, and religious studies. This comprehensive education created a ruling class that was both competent in practical affairs and committed to the ideals and traditions of their civilization. As the centuries passed and the Atlantean Empire reached its greatest extent, controlling territories from the Atlantic Ocean to the edges of Egypt and Italy, subtle changes began to appear in the character of the people. The immense wealth and power that had accumulated over generations of expansion began to corrupt the noble simplicity that had characterized the early kings and their subjects. The divine blood that flowed in Atlantean veins became diluted over time, mixed with that of mortal subjects and foreign allies. While this mixing brought practical benefits in terms of population growth and cultural diversity, it also weakened the spiritual connection to Poseidon that had been the source of Atlantean wisdom and virtue. The kings and nobles began to lose the divine guidance that had made their ancestors wise and just rulers. The changes were subtle at first, manifesting primarily in an increased love of luxury and display. The simple ceremonies and modest lifestyles of the early kings gave way to elaborate rituals and sumptuous living. The palaces grew ever more magnificent, while the clothing and personal ornaments of the nobility became increasingly elaborate and expensive. This growing love of luxury was accompanied by an increased ambition for conquest and domination. Where the early Atlanteans had expanded primarily for trade and colonization, their descendants began to view military conquest as an end in itself. The wealth and power of their empire made them proud and arrogant, leading them to believe that they were destined to rule over all other peoples. The corruption of Atlantean character was most clearly visible in their treatment of subject peoples and allies. The fair and generous policies of the early empire gave way to increasingly harsh extraction of tribute and resources. Colonial governors became more autocratic, while the rights and customs of local populations were increasingly disregarded in favor of Atlantean interests. The internal governance of Atlantis itself began to deteriorate as the ancient laws and customs were neglected or reinterpreted to serve the interests of the powerful. The sacred gatherings of the kings became less frequent and more focused on planning military campaigns than on maintaining justice and order. The balance between the different kingdoms that had been carefully maintained for centuries began to shift as stronger rulers sought to dominate their neighbors. The most serious manifestation of Atlantean decline was their growing ambition to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. No longer content with their vast territories in the west, they began to plan the conquest of Egypt, Greece, and all the lands that bordered the Mediterranean Sea. This ambition brought them into conflict with peoples who had previously been their trading partners and allies. The military campaigns that followed were initially successful, as the vast resources and military might of Atlantis overwhelmed the smaller city-states and kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. Atlantean armies swept across North Africa and into Europe, conquering territory after territory with apparent ease. The sight of their great fleets blockading harbours and their disciplined armies marching across the landscape struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. But the very success of these campaigns revealed the moral corruption that had overtaken Atlantean civilization. The conquered peoples were treated with increasing cruelty, while the wealth looted from their territories was used to fund even more ambitious military adventures. The noble ideals of justice and wisdom that had characterized the early Atlantean kings were replaced by simple greed for power and domination. It was in this context of moral decline and military aggression that Atlantis encountered its most formidable opponent, the city of Athens. Unlike the other peoples who had fallen before Atlantean might, the Athenians possessed both the military skill and the moral courage necessary to resist the invaders. The conflict that followed would determine not only the fate of Greece, but the destiny of Atlantis itself. The war between Atlantis and Athens was unlike any conflict that had occurred in the ancient world. On one side stood the vast empire of Atlantis, with its enormous armies, mighty fleets, and accumulated wealth of centuries. On the other stood the small but determined city of Athens, fighting not merely for its own survival, but for the freedom of all the peoples threatened by Atlantean expansion. The Athenians had been preparing for this conflict for years, having recognized the growing threat posed by Atlantean expansion. They had strengthened their military forces, improved their fortifications, and formed alliances with other Greek city-states who shared their determination to resist foreign domination. When the Atlantean invasion finally came, Athens was ready to meet it. The early stages of the war favored Atlantis, as their superior numbers and resources allowed them to win several significant victories. Atlantean fleets controlled the seas around Greece, while their armies occupied much of the countryside. The situation appeared hopeless for the defenders, as city after city fell to the overwhelming force of the invaders. But the Athenians possessed advantages that the Atlanteans had not anticipated. Fighting on their home territory, they had the support of the local population and intimate knowledge of the terrain. More importantly, they were fighting for their freedom and the survival of their way of life, while the Atlanteans were fighting merely for conquest and plunder. The turning point came when the Athenians managed to break the Atlantean naval blockade and launch a series of successful attacks on enemy supply lines. The enormous Atlantean armies, dependent on regular shipments of food and equipment from their distant homeland, began to experience shortages that affected their combat effectiveness. The disciplined coordination that had made them so formidable began to break down, as individual units found themselves cut off from central command. As the war continued, the moral dimensions of the conflict became increasingly clear to observers throughout the ancient world. The Athenians, despite their smaller numbers and limited resources, fought with a courage and determination that inspired admiration even among their enemies. Their leaders demonstrated the kind of wisdom and virtue that the Atlantean kings had once possessed, but had lost through generations of corruption. The contrast between the two civilizations became a subject of discussion among philosophers and historians throughout the Mediterranean world. Atlantis, for all its material wealth and military power, had lost the spiritual qualities that had made it great. Athens, though smaller and poorer, had preserved the virtues of courage, wisdom, and justice that were the true foundations of civilization. The final phase of the war saw the complete collapse of Atlantean military power in the eastern Mediterranean. Their armies, demoralized by constant defeats and abandoned by their increasingly unreliable supply lines, began to disintegrate. Many units surrendered or deserted, while others attempted to fight their way back to the coast where they might find ships to carry them home. The Atlantean fleet, once the terror of the Mediterranean, found itself unable to maintain its positions in the face of determined Greek resistance. The skilled seamanship and innovative tactics of the Athenian navy, combined with the support of local populations who provided intelligence and supplies, gradually wore down the numerical advantages of the invaders. But even as Athens celebrated its victories and the liberation of the conquered territories, the gods were preparing a far more dramatic resolution to the conflict. The moral corruption of Atlantis had not gone unnoticed by the divine powers who had originally blessed the island and its people. Zeus himself king of the gods and guardian of justice, had observed with growing displeasure the transformation of the noble Atlanteans into tyrannical conquerors. The divine council that convened to discuss the fate of Atlantis included all the major gods of the ancient world. Poseidon, despite his role as the divine ancestor of the Atlanteans, could not defend their actions or argue for their preservation. The evidence of their corruption was too clear, their violations of divine law too numerous and serious to be overlooked. The decision was made to destroy Atlantis entirely, not merely as punishment for their crimes, but as a warning to all future civilizations about the consequences of moral corruption. The method chosen for this destruction would be swift and absolute, ensuring that no trace of the corrupt empire would remain to influence future generations. The instruments of divine wrath were the very forces that had originally blessed Atlantis, the sea and the earth. Poseidon, lord of earthquakes and storms, would unleash the full fury of his domain against the island that had once been his greatest creation. The destruction would be so complete that even the location of Atlantis would be forgotten, lost beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The final day of Atlantis began like any other, with the sun rising over the concentric rings of the great city and the usual bustle of activity in the harbours and marketplaces. The defeat of their armies in the eastern Mediterranean had been a severe blow, but the island itself remained secure and prosperous. Few of the inhabitants suspected that this would be their last day on Earth. The first signs of the approaching catastrophe came in the form of minor earthquakes that shook the island throughout the morning. Such tremors were not uncommon in a region known for its seismic activity, and most people paid them little attention. But those with knowledge of natural phenomena noticed that these earthquakes were different, more frequent and intense than usual. As the day progressed, the earthquakes became stronger and more frequent. Buildings began to crack and sway, while the water in the harbour rings sloshed back and forth with increasing violence. Animals throughout the island became restless and agitated, sensing the approaching disaster with instincts that humans had long forgotten. The royal palace, built on the central island where Poseidon had first found Plato, was among the first structures to show serious damage. Cracks appeared in the walls covered with orichalcum, while the great temple of Poseidon shook on its foundations. The golden statue of the god swayed ominously, as if the deity himself was preparing to abandon his creation. By midday, the situation had become critical. The larger earthquakes were causing widespread damage throughout the city, while tidal waves generated by underwater tremors were flooding the lower-lying areas. The carefully engineered harbour system, once the pride of Atlantean engineering, was being overwhelmed by waters that surged back and forth with increasing violence. The population of Atlantis, realizing at last the magnitude of the disaster that was befalling them, began to panic. The harbours filled with people desperately trying to escape by sea, while others fled to the higher ground of the mountainous regions. But there was no escape from the divine judgment that had been pronounced upon them. The climax came in the afternoon, when the most powerful earthquake in recorded history shook the island to its very foundations. The carefully constructed rings of land and water, the product of both divine creation and human engineering, began to collapse into the sea. The bridges that connected the rings crumbled, while the great walls that had protected the city for so many centuries toppled into the churning waters. The palace and temple complex on the central island, the heart of Atlantean civilization, was among the last to succumb to the destruction. As the island itself began to sink beneath the waves, the great temple of Poseidon was engulfed by the sea, its golden statue disappearing forever beneath the dark waters. The orichalcum-covered walls of the palace which had gleamed like fire in the sunlight, vanished into the depths, taking with them the accumulated treasures of centuries. The final moments of Atlantis were witnessed by few and recorded by none of its own people. The few ships that managed to escape the harbor before the final collapse carried survivors who would spend the rest of their lives telling incredible stories that few would believe. They spoke of a great island that had vanished in a single day, of a civilization that had possessed knowledge and power beyond imagination, of a divine judgment that had wiped clean the slate of human ambition. As night fell over the Atlantic Ocean, nothing remained of the mighty empire that had once controlled much of the known world. The concentric rings of the great city, the magnificent palaces and temples, the vast fleets and armies, all had vanished beneath the waves. Even the island itself had disappeared, leaving only a muddy shoal that made navigation dangerous for ships attempting to pass through the area. The destruction of Atlantis sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world that extended far beyond the immediate physical effects of the catastrophe. The sudden disappearance of such a powerful empire created a vacuum that other civilizations struggled to fill, while the survivors who reached distant shores brought with them fragmentary knowledge of Atlantean achievements that would influence human development for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of the disaster saw significant changes in the balance of power throughout the Mediterranean world. The Greek city-states, freed from the threat of Atlantean conquest, were able to develop their own distinctive forms of government and culture. Athens, in particular, benefited from its victory over the invaders, gaining prestige and influence that would make it a center of learning and philosophy for centuries to come. The colonies and territories that had been controlled by Atlantis found themselves suddenly independent, forced to develop their own systems of government and defense. Some of these regions prospered in their newfound freedom, while others fell into chaos or were conquered by neighboring powers. The carefully maintained trade networks that had connected the Atlantean Empire gradually dissolved, leading to economic disruption and the loss of many technological and cultural achievements. The knowledge and techniques that had made Atlantis great were largely lost with the destruction of the island. The engineering skills that had created the great irrigation systems and harbor works, the metallurgical knowledge that had produced orichalcum and other advanced alloys, the navigation techniques that had allowed Atlantean ships to traverse the oceans with confidence, all disappeared with the civilization that had developed them. Some fragments of Atlantean knowledge survived, preserved by colonists and traders who had been away from the island when it was destroyed. These survivors, scattered across the ancient world, carried with them partial understanding of Atlantean achievements that they attempted to recreate in their new homes. The influence of these fragments can be traced in the development of later civilizations, particularly in areas such as architecture, engineering, and navigation. The mystery of Atlantis began almost immediately after its destruction, as the few eyewitness accounts were passed down through generations of storytellers. Each retelling added new details or modified existing ones, while the passage of time made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between historical fact and mythical elaboration. The very completeness of the destruction ensured that no physical evidence remained to verify or contradict the stories. The Egyptian priests who preserved the story and eventually transmitted it to Solon were among the most reliable keepers of the Atlantean tradition. Their temple records, maintained with scrupulous care over many centuries, provided the most detailed and consistent account of the lost civilization. But even these records were limited by the perspective of their authors and the inevitable changes that occur when stories are transmitted across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The priests of Sais, who served as the primary custodians of the Atlantean records, were themselves inheritors of a tradition that stretched back through generations of religious scholars. The temple archives contained not only written records, but also oral traditions that had been passed down from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of transmission. The combination of written and oral sources provided a rich and detailed picture of Atlantean civilization, but it also meant that the story was subject to the interpretations and emphases of each generation of priests. When Solon visited Egypt in the 6th century BCE, he encountered a tradition that had been carefully preserved but inevitably modified by centuries of transmission. The priests who shared the story with him were sincere in their desire to preserve historical truth, but they were also products of their own culture and time. Their understanding of Atlantis was inevitably colored by Egyptian values, religious beliefs, and political concerns. Solon himself, as he listened to the accounts of the Egyptian priests, was struck by the parallels between the story of Atlantis and the political and moral issues facing his own time. The great Athenian lawgiver had spent his career trying to create just and stable institutions for his city-state, and the tale of a great civilization that had fallen due to moral corruption resonated deeply with his own concerns about the challenges facing Athens. The story that Solon brought back to Athens was thus already several steps removed from its original source. The Egyptian priests had preserved it according to their own understanding and cultural perspective, while Solon interpreted it through the lens of his own experiences and concerns. When he shared the story with his friends and fellow citizens, it underwent further transformation as it was adapted to Athenian interests and understanding. The transmission of the Atlantean story through Solon's family became another layer in its evolution. According to Plato's account, the story passed from Solon to Critias the elder, and from him to Critias the younger, who eventually shared it with Socrates and his circle. Each generation added its own interpretations and emphases, while the passage of time made certain details more prominent and others less so. By the time the story reached Plato in the 4th century BCE, it had been shaped by multiple layers of transmission and interpretation. The great philosopher, as he crafted his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, was working with material that had been filtered through Egyptian, Athenian, and family traditions, each of which had contributed to its current form. Plato's own treatment of the Atlantean story reflects his philosophical concerns and literary purposes. As a philosopher interested in questions of justice, governance, and the ideal state, he found in Atlantis a perfect vehicle for exploring these themes. The story allowed him to present both a vision of what a great civilization could achieve and a warning about the dangers that could lead to its destruction. The literary artistry with which Plato presented the story of Atlantis demonstrates his skill as both a philosopher and a storyteller. The vivid descriptions of the island's geography and architecture, the detailed account of its political and social institutions, and the dramatic narrative of its rise and fall all serve to make the story compelling and memorable, while also conveying important philosophical messages. The impact of Plato's version of the Atlantean story was immediate and lasting. His students and followers were fascinated by the detailed picture he had painted of this lost civilization, and they began to discuss and debate its implications. Some took the story as literal historical truth, while others interpreted it as an allegorical representation of philosophical principles. The academy that Plato founded became a center for the study and interpretation of the Atlantean story. Students and scholars from throughout the Greek world came to Athens to hear the dialogues and participate in discussions about their meaning. The story of Atlantis became part of the curriculum, studied alongside other works of philosophy, history, and literature. As the influence of Platonic philosophy spread throughout the Hellenistic world, the story of Atlantis spread with it. Scholars in Alexandria, Pergamon, and other centers of learning copied and studied Plato's dialogues, ensuring that the tale of the lost continent would be preserved for future generations. The great libraries of the ancient world all contained copies of the Timaeus and Critias, making the story available to anyone interested in studying it. The Roman conquest of the Greek world brought the story of Atlantis to an even wider audience. Roman scholars and writers, fascinated by Greek philosophy and literature, studied and commented on Plato's works. The story of Atlantis appealed to Roman sensibilities, particularly its themes of imperial power and the consequences of moral decline. Roman writers such as Cicero and Pliny the Elder made reference to Atlantis in their own works, helping to ensure its transmission to later generations. The story became part of the common cultural knowledge of the educated classes throughout the Roman Empire, referenced in literature and discussed in schools and academies. The early Christian period saw new interpretations of the Atlantean story as theologians and philosophers attempted to reconcile Platonic philosophy with Christian doctrine. Some Christian writers saw in the destruction of Atlantis a prefiguration of divine judgment, while others interpreted it as an allegory for the fall of humanity from divine grace. The preservation of classical learning in Byzantine libraries and Islamic centers of scholarship ensured that the story of Atlantis survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Byzantine scholars continued to copy and study Plato's dialogues, while Islamic philosophers such as Al-Farabi and Averroes engaged with Platonic ideas, including the account of Atlantis. The rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance brought renewed attention to the story of Atlantis. Humanist scholars, excited by their access to Greek philosophical works, found in the tale of the lost continent a subject that combined historical inquiry with philosophical speculation. The printing press made Plato's dialogues widely available, introducing the story to audiences throughout Europe. Renaissance explorers and geographers, inspired by the Age of Discovery, began to speculate about the possible location of Atlantis. The discovery of the Americas led some to suggest that the New World might be the remnant of the lost continent, while others proposed locations in the Atlantic Ocean or Mediterranean Sea. These geographical speculations added new dimensions to the Atlantean story, while maintaining its essential mystery. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries brought new approaches to the study of Atlantis. Scholars began to apply more rigorous historical and geographical analysis to Plato's account, attempting to separate historical fact from philosophical allegory. Some concluded that Atlantis was entirely fictional, while others maintained that it was based on genuine historical memories. The development of modern archaeology and geology in the 19th century provided new tools for investigating the Atlantean mystery. Archaeological discoveries in the Mediterranean region revealed evidence of advanced Bronze Age civilizations that had previously been unknown, leading some scholars to suggest that these might have provided the historical basis for Plato's account. The excavation of sites such as Troy, Knossos, and Akrotiri demonstrated that the ancient world had indeed contained sophisticated civilizations that had been forgotten for centuries before being rediscovered by modern scholarship. These discoveries lent credibility to the idea that Atlantis might also have been based on historical reality, even if the details had been embellished or altered in transmission. Geological studies of the Mediterranean region revealed evidence of ancient catastrophes that could have inspired stories of sudden destruction. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis were shown to have affected the region repeatedly throughout history, providing possible natural explanations for the destruction described in Plato's account. The volcanic eruption that destroyed the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri on the island of Thera has been proposed by many scholars as a possible inspiration for the Atlantis story. The sudden burial of this advanced Bronze Age civilization under volcanic ash, combined with the apparent decline of Minoan power in the aftermath of the eruption, provides a striking parallel to Plato's account of Atlantean destruction. Other scholars have suggested different locations and time periods for a historical Atlantis. Some have proposed connections to the sea peoples who invaded the Eastern Mediterranean in the Late Bronze Age, while others have suggested links to various cultures in the Atlantic Ocean or Western Europe. Each proposal has brought new evidence and interpretations to the ongoing debate about Atlantis. The 20th century saw the emergence of increasingly sophisticated approaches to the Atlantis question. Advances in underwater archaeology made it possible to explore submerged sites that might contain evidence of lost civilizations, while improvements in geological and oceanographic knowledge provided better understanding of how ancient catastrophes might have occurred. Computer modeling and satellite imagery have allowed modern researchers to test various theories about the location and destruction of Atlantis. Detailed maps of the ocean floor have revealed no trace of a sunken continent in the Atlantic Ocean, while geological surveys have provided precise information about the history of various proposed locations. Despite these technological advances, the mystery of Atlantis remains unsolved. The lack of definitive archaeological evidence for a civilization matching Plato's description has led many scholars to conclude that Atlantis was entirely fictional. However, the continued discovery of previously unknown ancient civilizations suggests that our knowledge of the past remains incomplete. The cultural impact of the Atlantis story has far exceeded its historical significance. The image of a lost golden age, a civilization of great wisdom and power that fell due to moral corruption, has become one of the most enduring myths of Western culture. The story has inspired countless works of literature, art, and popular entertainment, each adding new elements to the Atlantean tradition. Writers from Francis Bacon to Jules Verne have used Atlantis as a setting for utopian speculation and adventure stories. The lost continent has been portrayed as everything from a technological paradise to a spiritual sanctuary, reflecting the hopes and fears of each generation that has encountered the story. These fictional treatments have often influenced public perception of Atlantis as much as scholarly research. The modern era has seen an explosion of popular interest in Atlantis, fueled by advances in underwater exploration and the continuing human fascination with lost civilizations. Documentary films, television programs, and popular books have brought the story to audiences far beyond the academic world, ensuring that the mystery of Atlantis remains alive in contemporary culture. The development of New Age spirituality has created new interpretations of the Atlantean story, with some believers claiming that Atlantis was a spiritually advanced civilization whose wisdom can still be accessed through meditation and psychic channels. These modern mystical approaches have added yet another layer to the complex traditions surrounding Atlantis. The scientific search for Atlantis continues in the 21st century, with researchers using increasingly sophisticated technology to explore possible locations and test various theories. Underwater robots and sonar mapping have made it possible to survey vast areas of the ocean floor, while advances in climatology and geology have provided better understanding of how ancient civilizations might have been affected by natural disasters. The ongoing debate about Atlantis reflects broader questions about the relationship between history and mythology, the reliability of ancient sources, and the methods used to investigate the past. The story serves as a case study in how narratives are transmitted across cultures and time periods, and how they are modified by the needs and interests of each generation. Modern psychological and anthropological studies have provided new insights into why the Atlantis story has such enduring appeal. The narrative combines several elements that resonate deeply with human psychology. The Golden Age myth, the warning about hubris and moral decline, and the mystery of a lost civilization that possessed secrets we have forgotten. The search for Atlantis has also contributed to advances in various scientific fields. The need to explore underwater sites has driven improvements in marine archaeology and underwater technology, while the investigation of proposed locations has contributed to geological and oceanographic knowledge. Even if Atlantis itself is never found, the search has yielded valuable scientific discoveries. The story of Atlantis continues to evolve as new generations encounter it and add their own interpretations and speculations. The rise of digital technology has created new ways of visualizing and exploring the lost continent, while global communications have allowed researchers from around the world to collaborate in the search for answers. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, the mystery of Atlantis remains as compelling as ever. Whether viewed as historical reality, philosophical allegory, or cultural myth, the story continues to capture human imagination and inspire both scholarly research and popular fascination. The search for Atlantis has become a search for understanding about the nature of civilization itself, the rise and fall of cultures, and the eternal human quest for wisdom and truth. The final saga of Atlantis extends far beyond the moment when the last golden spire disappeared beneath the churning waters of the Atlantic. In the centuries and millennia that followed the Great Catastrophe, the influence of the lost civilization continued to ripple outward through time, touching the lives of countless individuals and shaping the development of human culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The immediate survivors of the catastrophe, those few who had escaped the island before its final destruction, found themselves scattered across the ancient world like seeds carried on the wind. These refugees, bearing within their memories fragments of Atlantean knowledge and culture, became unwitting agents of transformation in the societies that gave them shelter. Their stories, told around hearth fires and in marketplace gatherings, planted the seeds of legends that would grow and flourish in the fertile soil of human imagination. In the coastal settlements of North Africa, Atlantean refugees shared their knowledge of advanced agricultural techniques and irrigation systems. The sophisticated understanding of water management that had created the Great Plain of Atlantis found new expression in the oasis communities of the Sahara, where descendants of the survivors created gardens of remarkable beauty and productivity. The geometric patterns that had characterized Atlantean city planning appeared in the layouts of these settlements, creating harmonious spaces that reflected the divine order their ancestors had sought to embody. The metallurgical knowledge of the Atlanteans proved particularly valuable in their new homes. The secrets of working orichalcum had been lost with the destruction of the mines, but the general principles of advanced metalworking survived in the hands of skilled craftsmen who had been away from the island when catastrophe struck. Bronze alloys of exceptional quality began to appear in workshops throughout the Mediterranean, while new techniques for working gold and silver enriched the artistic traditions of many cultures. In the harbours of ancient Spain and Portugal, Atlantean navigators shared their knowledge of ocean currents and celestial navigation. The sophisticated understanding of tides and weather patterns that had enabled Atlantean ships to traverse vast distances safely became part of the maritime traditions of these coastal peoples. Star charts and navigation techniques that had guided Atlantean explorers to distant shores were adapted for use by local fishermen and traders, gradually spreading throughout the maritime communities of Western Europe. The architectural principles developed in Atlantis found new expression in the monumental structures erected by later civilizations. The use of massive stone blocks fitted together with mathematical precision, the incorporation of water features into building design, and the symbolic use of concentric circles and other geometric forms appeared in constructions throughout the ancient world, from the stone circles of Britain to the temple complexes of Malta. Echoes of Atlantean architectural philosophy can be traced in structures that have puzzled archaeologists for generations. The educational systems that had produced the wise rulers and skilled administrators of Atlantis influenced the development of learning in many cultures that received Atlantean refugees. The comprehensive curriculum that had combined practical skills with philosophical wisdom appeared in modified form in the schools of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. The emphasis on mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy that had characterized Atlantean education helped accelerate the development of these fields in the civilizations that inherited fragments of their knowledge. The religious and philosophical traditions of Atlantis underwent complex transformations as they merged with the belief systems of their new homes. The worship of Poseidon evolved into various forms of sea god veneration throughout the coastal regions of Europe and Africa, while the Atlantean understanding of cosmic order influenced the development of astronomical religions and mystery cults. The concept of divine judgment leading to civilization's destruction became embedded in the mythological traditions of many cultures, appearing in stories of great floods and divine punishment that can be found in virtually every corner of the ancient world. As generations passed and direct memories of Atlantis faded into legend, the influence of the lost civilization became more subtle, but no less profound. The scientific principles discovered by Atlantean scholars were rediscovered by later thinkers who built upon fragmentary knowledge preserved in oral traditions and half-remembered texts. The mathematical relationships that had governed Atlantean architecture appeared in the sacred geometry of classical temples, while astronomical observations made by Atlantean priests influenced the development of calendar systems throughout the ancient world. The political philosophy of Atlantis, with its emphasis on confederation and shared governance among related kingdoms, influenced the development of political institutions in many societies. The concept of kings bound by sacred laws and accountable to divine authority appeared in various forms throughout the ancient world, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the priest kings of Mesopotamia. The Atlantean understanding of the relationship between moral character and political authority became embedded in the wisdom traditions of many cultures. The economic principles that had governed Atlantean trade found new expression in the commercial networks that developed throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency that had facilitated Atlantean commerce influenced the development of trade systems in later civilizations. The concept of fair dealing and honest exchange that had characterized Atlantean merchants became part of the commercial ethics of many trading communities. The artistic traditions of Atlantis underwent transformation as they merged with local styles and materials. The marine motifs that had decorated Atlantean palaces appeared in the art of coastal peoples throughout Europe and Africa, while the use of precious metals and gems in ceremonial objects reflected the Atlantean love of beauty and craftsmanship. The musical traditions of Atlantis with their complex harmonies and sophisticated instruments, influenced the development of music in many cultures that received Atlantean refugees. The agricultural knowledge of Atlantis proved particularly valuable in regions that shared similar climatic conditions. The techniques for crop rotation, soil management, and selective breeding that had made the Atlantean plains so productive were adapted for use in the river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The cultivation of new plant varieties and the development of improved livestock breeds accelerated in regions where Atlantean agricultural knowledge took root. The medical and healing traditions of Atlantis, with their sophisticated understanding of anatomy and pharmacology, influenced the development of medicine in many ancient cultures. The use of plants and minerals for healing purposes, the understanding of the relationship between physical and mental health, and the development of surgical techniques all reflected knowledge that had originated in the medical schools of Atlantis. As the centuries passed, the direct influence of Atlantean refugees gradually diminished. But the cultural momentum they had created continued to shape human development. The civilizations that had received their knowledge continued to build upon it, creating new syntheses and innovations that carried forward the essential spirit of Atlantean achievement. The quest for knowledge, the love of beauty, and the understanding of cosmic order that had characterized Atlantis at its best became part of the permanent heritage of human civilization. The mystery schools that developed throughout the ancient world often trace their origins to Atlantean sources, claiming to preserve secret knowledge that had survived the Great Catastrophe. Whether or not these claims were historically accurate, the schools served to maintain and transmit philosophical and scientific knowledge that enriched the intellectual life of their times. The emphasis on wisdom, virtue, and the proper relationship between human beings and the divine that characterized these schools reflected the highest ideals of Atlantean civilization. The oracle traditions that played such important roles in ancient Greek religion may have had their origins in Atlantean prophetic practices. The understanding of natural phenomena as manifestations of divine will, the interpretation of omens and portents, and the role of sacred places as centers of divine communication all reflected elements of Atlantean religious practice. The famous oracle at Delphi, with its emphasis on self-knowledge and moral wisdom, embodied principles that had once been central to Atlantean spirituality. The development of written language and record-keeping systems throughout the ancient world was accelerated by the need to preserve and transmit the knowledge brought by Atlantean refugees. The creation of libraries and archives, the development of systematic approaches to organizing information, and the emergence of scholarly traditions dedicated to the preservation of knowledge all reflected the influence of Atlantean educational practices. The philosophical traditions that emerged in ancient Greece, with their emphasis on rational inquiry and systematic investigation of natural phenomena, built upon foundations that may have been laid by Atlantean thinkers. The pre-Socratic philosophers, who first attempted to explain natural phenomena through reason rather than mythology, were working within intellectual traditions that had been enriched by contact with Atlantean knowledge. The development of formal logic, mathematical proof, and scientific method all reflected approaches to knowledge that had characterized Atlantean scholarship. The astronomical observations and calculations that enabled ancient civilizations to create accurate calendars and predict celestial events often incorporated knowledge that had originated in Atlantean observatories. The understanding of planetary motions, the precession of the equinoxes, and the relationship between celestial and terrestrial cycles reflected centuries of careful observation and calculation that had reached high levels of sophistication in Atlantean science. The engineering achievements of later civilizations, from the pyramids of Egypt to the aqueducts of Rome, incorporated principles and techniques that may have had their origins in Atlantean engineering. The understanding of hydraulics, structural mechanics, and materials science that made these achievements possible reflected knowledge that had been highly developed in the construction projects of Atlantis. The legal systems that developed throughout the ancient world often incorporated principles that reflected Atlantean understanding of justice and governance. The concept of written law codes, the emphasis on procedural fairness, and the understanding of law as an expression of divine order all echoed principles that had governed Atlantean society. The development of international law and diplomatic protocols reflected the need to manage relationships between different peoples and cultures, a challenge that had been central to the administration of the Atlantean Empire. The artistic traditions that flourished in the classical world built upon foundations that had been enriched by contact with Atlantean aesthetics. The understanding of proportion, harmony, and the relationship between form and function that characterized classical art reflected principles that had reached high levels of development in Atlantean culture. The integration of art with architecture, the use of symbolic imagery to convey complex ideas, and the creation of works that serve both practical and spiritual purposes all reflected Atlantean influence. The musical traditions of the ancient world incorporated elements that may have originated in Atlantean composition and performance practices. The understanding of mathematical relationships in music, the development of complex harmonic structures, and the use of music in religious and ceremonial contexts all reflected knowledge that had been highly developed in Atlantean culture. The theatrical traditions that emerged in ancient Greece, with their emphasis on moral instruction and emotional catharsis, may have had their origins in Atlantean dramatic practices. The understanding of the relationship between performance and audience, the use of mythological themes to explore contemporary issues, and the development of complex dramatic structures all reflected theatrical knowledge that had reached sophisticated levels in Atlantean society. The athletic traditions that culminated in the Olympic Games incorporated training methods and competitive practices that may have had their origins in Atlantean physical education. The understanding of human anatomy and physiology, the development of systematic training regimens, and the emphasis on the relationship between physical and mental development all reflected knowledge that had been central to Atlantean education. The culinary traditions that developed throughout the Mediterranean world incorporated ingredients, preparation methods, and flavor combinations that may have originated in Atlantean kitchens. The understanding of nutrition, the development of preservation techniques, and the creation of elaborate ceremonial meals all reflected culinary knowledge that had reached high levels of sophistication in Atlantean culture. As the influence of Atlantis spread and evolved throughout the ancient world, it underwent continuous transformation and adaptation. Each culture that received elements of Atlantean knowledge modified and integrated them according to local needs and conditions. This process of cultural synthesis created new forms of expression that carried forward the essential spirit of Atlantean achievement, while adapting to changing circumstances. The Roman Empire, as it absorbed and unified much of the Mediterranean world, also absorbed and synthesized many elements of Atlantean cultural heritage. The Roman genius for organization and administration built upon governmental principles that may have had their origins in Atlantean political philosophy. The Roman legal system, with its emphasis on written law and procedural fairness, reflected principles of justice that had been central to Atlantean governance. The engineering achievements of Rome, particularly in the areas of water management and urban planning, incorporated techniques and principles that may have originated in Atlantean construction projects. The Roman understanding of hydraulics, their skill in working with concrete and other building materials, and their ability to coordinate massive construction projects all reflected knowledge that had been highly developed in Atlantean civilization. The cultural synthesis that characterized the Hellenistic period as Greek civilization spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond also served to preserve and transmit elements of Atlantean heritage. The Great Library of Alexandria, with its systematic collection and organization of knowledge, embodied principles of scholarship that may have had their origins in Atlantean educational institutions. The mystery religions that flourished throughout the Roman Empire often claimed to preserve ancient wisdom that had survived from before the Great Catastrophe. Whether or not these claims were historically accurate, the religions served to maintain spiritual and philosophical traditions that embodied the highest aspirations of human civilization, the emphasis on personal transformation, the understanding of the soul's relationship to cosmic order, and the promise of wisdom for those who proved worthy, all reflected themes that had been central to Atlantean spirituality. The rise of Christianity brought new interpretations of the Atlantean legacy, as early Christian writers saw in the destruction of the lost civilization a prefiguration of divine judgment and the need for spiritual renewal. The story of Atlantis became part of a larger narrative about human pride and divine justice, serving as a warning about the consequences of moral corruption and the importance of humility before God. The preservation of classical learning in the monasteries of medieval Europe ensured that the story of Atlantis would survive the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Medieval scholars, working to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian theology, found in the tale of Atlantis a complex allegory that could be interpreted on multiple levels. The story served as both a historical account of divine judgment and a philosophical meditation on the nature of human civilization. The Islamic conquest of much of the former Roman Empire brought new perspectives to the interpretation of Atlantean heritage. Islamic scholars, with their emphasis on the preservation and transmission of knowledge, collected and studied classical texts that contained references to Atlantis. The story became part of the broader Islamic understanding of history as a series of civilizations that rose and fell according to divine will. The cultural renaissance that began in medieval Islamic centers of learning and later spread to Europe brought renewed interest in classical learning and ancient wisdom. The story of Atlantis, preserved in the dialogues of Plato, became part of the curriculum in universities and academies throughout the medieval world. Scholars debated its historical accuracy and philosophical significance, ensuring that the tale would continue to influence human thought. The age of exploration that began in the late medieval period brought new relevance to the story of Atlantis. As European explorers ventured into previously unknown regions of the Atlantic Ocean, the possibility that they might discover traces of the lost civilization captured public imagination. The discovery of the Americas led to speculation that the New World might be connected to Atlantis, while the exploration of the Atlantic Ocean floor became a quest for physical evidence of the lost continent. The scientific revolution of the early modern period brought new methods and technologies to the study of Atlantis. The development of more accurate maps, improved understanding of geology and oceanography, and the application of critical historical methods all contributed to a more sophisticated understanding of the Atlantean tradition. While some scholars concluded that the story was entirely fictional, others maintained that it contained genuine historical elements that had been preserved in mythological form. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern technology created new possibilities for the search for Atlantis. the development of underwater exploration techniques, the improvement of geological surveys, and the application of scientific methods to archaeological investigation all offered the possibility of finding physical evidence for the lost civilization. While no such evidence has been definitively identified, the search has contributed to our understanding of ancient history and underwater archaeology. The modern era has seen an explosion of interest in Atlantis that extends far beyond academic circles. The story has inspired countless works of fiction, from novels and films to television programs and video games. Each new interpretation adds to the rich tapestry of Atlantean legend, ensuring that the story continues to evolve and influence popular culture. The development of New Age spirituality has brought new interpretations of the Atlantean story, with some believing that the lost civilization possessed advanced spiritual knowledge that can still be accessed through meditation and other esoteric practices. These modern mystical interpretations, while not accepted by mainstream scholarship, demonstrate the continuing power of the Atlantean story to inspire spiritual seeking and philosophical reflection. The technological advances of the 21st century have created new possibilities for investigating the Atlantean mystery. Satellite imagery, computer modeling, and advanced underwater exploration techniques have made it possible to survey vast areas of the ocean floor and test various theories about the location and nature of the lost civilization. While no definitive evidence has yet been found, the search continues to yield valuable scientific discoveries and insights into ancient history. The story of Atlantis has also become a metaphor for contemporary concerns about civilization and its relationship to the natural world. In an age of environmental crisis and technological change, the tale of a great civilization that fell due to moral corruption and divine judgment has particular relevance. The story serves as both a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and a vision of what human civilization might achieve if guided by wisdom and virtue. The legacy of Atlantis continues to unfold in ways that Plato could never have imagined when he first crafted his philosophical allegory. The story has become part of the permanent heritage of human civilization, inspiring generation after generation to dream of lost golden ages and to strive for the wisdom and virtue that might create new ones. Whether viewed as history or mythology, as fact or fiction, the tale of Atlantis continues to speak to the deepest aspirations of the human spirit. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin, the story of Atlantis takes on a special power. The vision of a civilization that achieved greatness through wisdom and virtue, that created beauty and harmony in accordance with divine order, and that ultimately fell due to the corruption of human pride, speaks to the eternal questions that face every generation. What does it mean to build a just society? How can human beings live in harmony with the natural world and the cosmic order? What are the dangers that threaten every civilization, and how can they be avoided? The gentle waves that lap against distant shores carry within their rhythm the echo of those ancient questions. In the rise and fall of the tides, in the eternal cycling of the seasons, in the movement of the stars across the night sky, the story of Atlantis continues to unfold. The lost continent lives on not in any physical location, but in the realm of human consciousness, where the greatest truths are preserved not in stone or metal, but in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we might become. The final saga of Atlantis is not one of discovery, but of transformation, not of finding what was lost, but of creating what has never been. The seeds planted by that ancient civilization, scattered by the winds of time and the currents of cultural transmission, continue to sprout in unexpected places and seasons. Every act of wisdom, every creation of beauty, every gesture of justice and compassion carries within it something of the spirit that once animated the concentric rings of the great city. The gods who destroyed Atlantis in a single day and night of catastrophic judgment did not simply punish a corrupt empire. They planted a question in the depths of human consciousness that continues to challenge every generation. The question is not whether Atlantis existed or where it might be found, but whether human beings can learn from the tale of its rise and fall to create civilizations worthy of the divine trust placed in mortal hands. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest secret of Atlantis, that it exists not in the past, but in the future, not in what was, but in what yet might be. The lost continent awaits rediscovery not by explorers of the ocean depths, but by builders of human community, not by archaeologists seeking ancient ruins, but by philosophers seeking eternal truth. The true Atlantis is the civilization we have not yet built, the golden age we have not yet created, the harmony between human aspiration and divine order that remains the eternal possibility and promise of human existence. As the gentle rhythm of breathing deepens into sleep, as consciousness drifts toward the realm of dreams where all possibilities remain alive, the story of Atlantis completes its ancient purpose. It serves not as an account of what was lost, but as a vision of what might be found, not as a tale of destruction, but as a promise of renewal, not as an ending, but as an eternal beginning that awaits each soul willing to take up the work of building heaven upon earth.